Hi, everyone. This is the Ego Project, and I am Lisa Heidle, and I am here with,
Cristine Seidell.
and we are here with,
Nicole Spindler.
very nice. Okay, great. Today with Nicole, we are going to be talking about grief and loss. It's going to be a very powerful conversation. I have absolutely no doubt about that. Before we get started, we want to encourage everyone to go back and listen to our last episode with Eric Goldstein, and where we explored masculinity, divine feminine, divine masculine, creativity. It's so powerful. I love that conversation. What do you think, Cristine?
I loved it too. And I think honestly, we just started scratching the surface. So I think we may be adding a part 2 to this conversation too. So, be on the lookout for that as well.
I have no doubt. And Eric is so eloquent and vulnerable. I just cannot wait to continue that conversation with him.
Agreed.
Okay, well, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to read Nicole's bio, and then Nicole, you can add whatever you think is pertinent to that, and then we'll jump on in. Okay, so Nicole Spindler is a writer, a public speaker, and learning and development enthusiast. She graduated from John Carroll University, specializing in human resources and management. She published her first book, a memoir titled Beyond Life's Moments, in December 2022, about viewing her father's rare cancer journey as transformative rather than traumatic. In May 2022, she published her debut fiction novel, The Reason Why, which explores how loving all there is to you and your life is the key to unlocking all the other forms of love in our lives, including family ties, friendships, and relationships. Besides pursuing her passions, Nicole loves spending time with family and friends, exploring her hometown, traveling, staying active, sharing her stories with others, and exploring the local bookstores for more books to read with a cup of coffee or tea always in hand. I think we might be soulmates, Nicole.
I know.
Unfortunately, I don't have a cup of tea or coffee on me at this moment, which is a very rare thing, but here we are.
Made me need to drink something. Yes, I love that bio. Go ahead, tell us a little bit, what you said, your hometown. What is your hometown again?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Wow, lots to explore there for sure. Yeah.
Yes, and it's always the debate on whether we're considered part of the East Coast or are we part of the Midwest. My vote is Midwest. We are so much more like Chicago, Cleveland than we are like Philadelphia, New York, like 100%.
Yeah, how funny. The debate continues.
I did not know there were camps, but I will have to reflect on that. I'll get back to it.
Perfect.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit about your book, Beyond Life's Moments? Can you give us some insight into that? What made you write the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So Beyond Life's Moments was a work kind of about almost a decade in the making. And it all kind of started out in about 2012. I found out in January of that year that my father, who, loved running, he was one of the healthiest people I ever met, never drank, smoked. He was diagnosed with one of the most rare forms of cancer called O-factor neuroblastoma, which it impacts, it's actually on the frontal lobe of your brain. And it impacts a lot of your neurological symptoms. So it impacted like his smell and sensory information. And it was so rare at the time that there was only one doctor in the entire world who was studying this, was willing to even attempt this surgery. And it happened to be in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, actually, which is it's called UPMC Presbyterian Hospital, which is University of Pittsburgh's campus. So I was in high school at the time, and I, didn't know like how to process this other than like, I knew there had to be a reason why we were going through this. I knew there was, that was our first big traumatic, big blow up we had in our family. Like I thought our life was perfect in my eyes. It was great. And then this thing just kind of came just like thrown in our circle. And I kind of, found writing, journaling to be my outlet to process things and find the good in these moments every day, whether that was like, my father could swallow a pill today. That was great. Or like, hey, like I did, I scored a goal on my lacrosse team. That's great. I just tried to find the good in these situations and find the meaning behind this experience in our lives. So that's kind of how Beyond Life's Moments came to be. It's the lessons that I learned, those kind of, at least publishing wise, 8 years that I was kind of going through this and dealing with the aftermath of it too. So it's lessons that I hope people can kind of embrace in their own life, whether they've, or have dealt with a serious illness, or maybe, were injured in a car accident or grew up with an abusive household. Just being able to navigate life's challenging moments.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that you took a situation that many people would have allowed to define them in the negative. This shouldn't be happening, why did, this is wrong, the injustice of it all. And you're like, okay, this is something that happens in life, and how am I going to navigate it? And so that's going to open us up to the conversation about loss and grief here, because I've yet to meet anyone who hasn't been touched by loss or grief. And that's, we're talking about the broad brush definition of loss and grief, that it could be anything. It can be, of course, the loss to death. It could be, the loss of a job, the loss of a relationship. I talk to people who they grieve their youth, grieving their youth, their mobility. There's so much to, that anytime something is ending or transitioning into something else, we have to go through that process of grief. And grief is its own animal. Right? It's not depression. It's not anxiety. It is its own emotion and its own feeling. Cristine, can you share a little bit through a therapeutic lens what grief looks like through therapy and that process?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's, when we talk about grieving or we talk about grief, it's so multifaceted, because it's a process. Grieving is a process, and it can look so different for so many people. And really what it comes down to is like, grieving is pain and sorrow, because it is like you said, it's the loss, it's the ending of something that we cannot go back to. It's something that we cannot, we can't go replace, we can't rewind, we can't somehow start again that exact scenario or that person, and so it's the ultimate ending. And I oftentimes see with clients, grieving of childhood. I'll work with clients who are in middle school, and you can see them just like in a lot of pain because they're grieving that they're no longer a little kid anymore, and there's this very just innate and intuitive grieving that we go through during the loss of different things. But ultimately it's a process. It looks differently. There is no correct way to grieve. There are maladaptive ways to grieve, but no correct way. But from the perspective of the ego, any kind of trauma or loss or shift will create some form of wounding that we have to be aware of. And so Nicole, what I love about your process with this book is that you chose to make the wounding have some reflection of growth, some reflect, intuitively you were looking for healing in the wounding at the same time, and I think that is such a really cool aspect of you just sitting in some knowing and some sensing and following that. So, from a therapeutic perspective, it's awesome to see somebody who really started in the grieving process, trying to work on transformation. So, yeah.
So when you started compiling the information for the book, because in the book, Beyond Life's Moments, you speak about, you bring other thought leaders and their views on loss and grief into the conversation, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about why you did that, how that helped you through the transformation and processing of the grief?
Yeah, I think for me, like at the time, I don't look on it as a huge negative, even back then, but like I just didn't, there was no resources available to me when I was going through that. I mean, I was very thankful that, I had my teachers and a guidance counselor that helped me get through the school academic wise and manage my workload. But in terms of, how do I move forward with my life? And because at that time, I was trying to be a student, a daughter, an athlete, but I also was a caregiver. My childhood, like, kind of went out the door. And so nobody teaches you how to grieve, but also no one teaches you how to live either. So, or to love. Those are all things, I mean, they're common in all our lives. Grief, living, and love, like, you're not taught those. You were meant to experience them. And so for me, like, a lot of it was just like exploring. I mean, I did so much research, and I think one good example or thought leader that I stumbled upon was actually like Stephen Hawking, for instance, because at the time, I think when I was going through that with my dad, that's when like the movie The Theory of Everything it came out, which by the way is like one of my favorite movies. And I just fell in love with that story because the way just the way that, again, like, he did not let his illness defy who he was. In fact, it only made him stronger. It pushed him harder to kind of do more research and everything like that. And I incorporate other people as well, like Gabby Giffords. I incorporate Ryan Shazier. So I did a lot of research initially, but then what I found though was, and this was like 6 months into kind of dealing with my dad's diagnosis, was after kind of writing it down for a while, I kind of started to finally feel like, I need to talk about this with some of my friends. I need to admit this to like my lacrosse team, because like they would notice I would get upset for some reason. They're like, well, why is she crying? I over time started opening up to like people outside like my immediate family. And that's when just the compassion and empathy became pouring in. It was coming through, but it was like buckets at that point, because I learned that there was somebody on my lacrosse team who her mom had cancer like 2 years ago. And she knew exactly what it was like. And just those kind of similar, connections and relations to kind of experiencing that stuff was so humbling. And that's, I think, how I would say that, those stories kind of came to life, and other real life people, just normal people like me. That's why some of their stories are in it too, because they've been able to, recognize that, yeah, like, I'm not letting this define me. Like, I'm going to evolve from this. I'm going to learn the lessons and move forward with my life. And I found, I read my book sometimes and reference it when I talk, and I get goosebumps every time I read some of the stories, because they're hits so powerful, just as much as when I originally heard the story myself.
I think that is a really compelling point that you make about, the moment that you shifted from experiencing the grieving process to sharing with others in your grieving, was you opened it up to be kind of attended to, mm-hmm. And I think that's a part of the grieving process, is we have this desire to be witnessed in our grieving, to be acknowledged that there's pain and sorrow and suffering, and there are people there who can sit in that space with us. And that's a very scary thing, I think, sometimes to try and share with people, especially in our culture that does not like to sit in grief. Our culture, especially in the US, does not deal with grieving, even ritualistically. Like, we don't like to dabble with it too much, right? And so, I think that intuitive component and the fact that you were writing so much and seeing these patterns during those first 6 months then reflected to you, I need to share this. I need others to witness what I'm experiencing, is a very important piece of the process of grieving. And I think that might be where a lot of people get stuck, when they won't allow others to attend to them there.
I agree, as well as like, at some points too, I just felt like I just needed to be listened to. You know what I mean? Like, I kind of knew since the very beginning, but even to this day, like, with my grief still, like in other ways. Like I just sometimes want people to just listen to me and just hold the weight of my feelings for a little bit. I don't want them to carry them. I don't want to purge and like dump stuff on them, but just have a little bit of like compassion for me and understand maybe what I'm going through. That goes miles distance, because yeah, like nobody will know what it was like for me other, even my, being at home at the time, even my, my own parents, and my own sibling don't know truly exactly what I was feeling. And that's where, like, again, being able to write down and convey my emotions without repressing them, I think again, it came to me, but I do feel like it was one of the best decisions I ever made to positively and in a healthy way work through these emotions.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
What you're saying is so close to my heart. When you were saying there isn't a lot of references, and I lost my father when I was 15, and quite a few years ago, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't know how to talk about it. I was so young. And so I went to the library, as we bookies do, right? And there were like 3 books. I took them out, and one talked about the different stages of grief, right? So I wrote them down, and every time I felt like, I'm like, okay, there's anger, check. And I went through all of them. I was like, well, I'm done grieving. Because I didn't have anyone to connect with on it to help me process through it. And looking back now, of course, it's a funny little anecdote, and kind of sad a little bit. But it's also, so many people do that. Like they don't know, especially if they've never had a loss or a grief, a big one like that. They don't know how to even express what they need, and because it's all new, it's all foreign to them. And so I think that's having a resource out there like yours, Nicole, is going to be so valuable for people on this path. Right now I have 2 friends that just lost family members, and they're in the grief and moving through it and processing through it, and that's the only way to do it, is to go through it. And the thing that I think is so beautiful with them is they're not grief bypassing. So often, kind of that people grieve by, like, oh, well, I grieved it when I found out he was sick, or when she was dying. So I'm done with my grief. It's like, oh no, there's, years can go by and a new aspect of grieving can show up, when you do, an accomplishment. My mother passed in 2012, and then I published a book, and she didn't get to see that. I grieve that. It's not as deep as it was when she passed, but I allowed myself to feel the feelings. I didn't repress them. I didn't suppress. I didn't try to logic them. Yeah, so many people do with grief and loss. They try to put logic around it. It's like, it is, you have to feel it in order to process it. Do you see that, Cristine, a lot, where people come in who are grieving, or maybe they don't come to you at the beginning? They come for another reason. Yeah.
And I think that also, depending on what it is they're grieving, people will try to qualify or quantify their grief, and or the age of somebody who's grieving. Interestingly enough, as I'm listening to us talk, I lost my sister in high school. So, it's kind of one of those things that, like, the age that you end up kind of having grief, I don't think there are a lot of people who know how to help, children grieve, because they're in oftentimes their own grieving as well, or they don't know how to help people grieve younger people, so there's this whole discomfort in being able to know that it's okay to grieve in whatever way you feel like you need to grieve, and or how to hold that space, like you were saying, Nicole, of giving people permission, which is really compassion. Compassion is, I give you permission to feel however you need to feel right now. When it comes to grieving and loss, and even, in experiences where it's not death, I've experienced, loss of a relationship, and people not really knowing how to sit and hold that space, or be like, don't you think it's time you got over it? Or don't you feel, don't you feel like you shouldn't be angry anymore? Like wanting to project, into that person's grieving process, how to do it correctly. And so I do feel like, as a therapist, therapy is a really great resource when it comes to grieving, because as a culture, as a society, so much of the people and the systems are uncomfortable with grief, that you have to have somebody who can really sit in that with you. And even as therapists, sometimes we're uncomfortable if it's counter transferring something in our own grieving process that we haven't fully processed through.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you find, Nicole, that people, because of the book that you've compiled and written and, is out there, and, people are experiencing it, do you find that people share their grief experiences with you a lot?
Yes, I have found that, and I I kind of was like shocked by it at first, but now I get it, because like it's exactly what I wanted. I wanted my book to be like a really good safe space. Like I wanted this to be the book with like, I didn't have this book when I went through, with my dad's diagnosis. So I wanted this book to be like the little like arm around your shoulder, like, hey, like there's someone out there who like gets it, who kind of has been through some stuff. Like it's gonna, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I've had a lot of the people approach me through talks, through email, and my book has touched a lot of different areas too. And they found comfort in areas I didn't even talk about much, because I just didn't have the space or the time, like divorce. I know a lot of my book's been used to help kids get through a divorce, like a really bad one with their parents, or some people have used it for grief of a passing of a loved one. So I think like, and it's good because like seeing those examples and everything, even or seeing even like my lessons that I learned being transformed and kind of transcending beyond the page to help others in other situations it's just been a very wonderful blessing to see that. And that at the end of the day is like the biggest honor and like reward I can get for having the courage to share my story.
Yeah.
It is courageous, because I think so often we don't want to make people uncomfortable. For years I didn't speak about my father's passing, and there's still people in my life that probably don't know how he passed. And mostly because they haven't asked. That's kind of on them, not on me. Their lack of curiosity is not my problem. But I think it does make people uncomfortable if they haven't experienced it. And I found that those who are well versed in loss and have processed through it are much more comfortable to say, yes, you can call me and be angry. Right? And express your frustration, your anger about what's happening. Please do. I can be a vessel for you. I can hold that. Those who have, maybe they've experienced loss but bypassed it, refused to feel the feelings, just kind of shoved them down and kept moving forward. Those are the ones who will quickly change the topic. They will tell you, maybe you should get over it, that type of, it's like, well, no, a loss is a loss, and that person is always in our life, right? I mean, whether they're here physically, they are always with us as memory. And so we have to constantly be having a relationship with them. And someone telling you to not talk about someone you still have a relationship with, that's painful. Yeah, and insensitive, I think. So, yeah.
Well, so what I kind of love about what you bring, Nicole, is that, we only have, the reason we grieve is because we loved very hard, like it came, from a place of just love and security and safety with a person or a thing or a situation, which makes the loss and the grief so painful, right? And what you used your creativity for was to come on the other side and be able to meet that love again. What was where it began is what you were able to find on the other side. Different,
Yeah.
and beyond probably what you thought it was going to be, but kind of that love on the other side of it. So can you tell us a little bit about how creativity was part of that processing? And then I can hear the love you have in being able to attend to people through that story, and through the book, and just kind of talk about how creativity played a part in that.
Yeah, I think to kind of not be the typical like self-help type book, right? Of like, oh, you have to do this, you have to do that. Because that there's no right, there's no like right, there's not like a step-by-step instruction guide to grieve and there or to process, your emotions sometimes. So I really found like when I really talked about, the little nuggets of stories and moments from that time period, like I really wanted just to, I kind of use a lot of color references in my story. And the saying like light at the end of the tunnel is so true. And it's a very powerful reference in my book, especially because, in Pittsburgh, I use the Fort Pitt tunnels, like a really good analogy of like, you just even get to the city, you have to go through this dark tunnel and like it's like a mile long. But then as soon as you emerge, it's like, bam, the city like hits you. And it's so pretty. And you just want to like stop driving, just enjoy the view.
Like soak it up.
I was gonna say, it's very hard, but like, yeah, you just want to soak it up and it's just all this light. And so I use a lot of, with my creativity, I use a lot of like color symbolism to depict kind of like the tone. Like a really good example is like, I share, one of the main lessons I share in my book has been gratitude and faith. That has been a huge, like, huge thing in my life, but especially my father. And I found like, didn't matter whether he, had a sucky day at chemo or, he, was like the early morning of getting ready. He always like had his rosary on him and he was like always praying. And and it was weird, like he was in a particular room in our house too, where like, it didn't matter what it was just during the day, sunrise, sunset, the sun would just hit his chair just right. And it would just kind of illuminate him. And I captured that in my story because it was like, very almost saint-like, very heavenly. So I really kind of channeled, I use that example because I tried to channel just everyday things I think we take for granted, or again, like you just kind of have to have those eyes for. So finding symbolism and color meaning. And I also really try to bring about examples that again aren't these like big blown up things. They're even just simple words that have been said, or it was just the simple act of kindness by a stranger that really made the difference and taught that lesson too. So I think those are just some very subtle ways I've been very creatively been able to convey these lessons and process loss and grief. Because I mean, just to use therapy as an example, I think a lot of people think, oh, I just need to go to a month of therapy and bam, I'm cured. And that's not how it works. It's little moments, it's progress, it's, the little homework assignments in between therapy sessions that get you there. And it's an ongoing process. It's not going to end. So that's why I really try to remind people that like, if you have kind of a big moment, great, but that's not going to be the complete, like, heal the wound and be done. There's so much strength and meaning in those little moments that just slide under the carpet sometimes. And you just need to pull them out and like shine some light on them for once.
Yeah. And I think that goes to, when you're talking about like using the colors and using the descriptions of these very simple spaces, right? How there's in simplicity, there's a lot of beauty, and that beauty is the wisdom of everything, so allowing the creativity to kind of reflect intuitively what you're trying to convey to people, I think is a beautiful way of honoring your own process of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so often we love to have everything kind of wrapped up with a bow, right? And if something happens that we don't understand or can't control, we try to put a meaning around it, right? And because it gives us a sense of control, right? Well, this is happening because of this and this and this, or this is happening, so that I can learn this and this and this. but your ability to kind of see the moments, like you said, the light shining in on your dad, that's a moment that only, as time passes, can you look back on that. But even in the moment, you were able to stop and recognize the beauty within it. And I think that's so often, like you said, the big moments, so often, people expect to have a movie, like, feel experience with the person who is passing or has passed. And really, it's those little moments. It's the, sharing a bowl of cereal together in the morning, it's the, watching a TV program and you're both enjoying it and laughing. And that's a memory that you never expected to take with you. But when you are through it and you look back, you're like, that was the moment that I felt the connection with the person that you lost, and I think that's so beautiful. I have to say, as a teenager, that you were already pulling all of this, and able to process. Now, my question for you is the ego aspect of this with the wounding and the healing. How much did your parents, because they're going through their own experiences, and your sister, and how much did they know you were doing this processing? Were they aware of it?
Well, so my parents, and then I have a brother, no sister.
Oh, brother, I'm sorry.
I wish I had a sister, but just a brother. My parents, I think, did a fantastic job, I think, of like making sure there was just so much normalcy, like as much as they could get. Like I remember like my, one of the first conversations I think my parents had with me, like when they first told me, was like my dad just said, like, I just want you to focus on school and lacrosse. And which I played in high school. And I held that promise, but still though, like I can't help that I'm living at home, and this is under my roof. I come home to this all the time. But I know, like, and I learned this over the years. But there was a lot I saw that and I was involved and heard a lot of conversations that, it's hard for anyone, let alone a 15-year-old girl, to like listen to about medical procedures and all this stuff and life expectancy. Like, and I learned, eventually, like my parents did start to kind of share some stuff more over the years about, how honestly, like I didn't really see my mom and dad cry, but they kind of kept it to themselves, to be honest. Like they wanted to stay strong for me and for each other. Like that was just a big example, like of how, they did their best just to kind of protect me, but also they knew though that they needed me involved in this. And to have like that courage for me, and that strength within me to kind of go through that with them, I was honored, and I wouldn't change it for the world. And I think even with my brother as well, I mean, at the time he was in college, like 3+ hours away. And, although he wasn't home all the time, he kind of decided to do what he could. Like a good example is like, he actually got involved with like for the kids fundraiser. So he got involved in raising money for charity for kids with cancer, just to hopefully, just contribute to that overall kind of, the struggles of those people who have cancer. And so it's, over the years, I think we've all kind of opened up a little bit. And I feel like, especially now, because as we're recording this, it's actually been almost 1 year since my dad passed. And we're still kind of processing it, and especially my mom and I, we've talked about it, of how like, it was just 10 years of constant up and down. And it's, we both remind each other that, yeah, we got 10 more years with dad, but again, it doesn't change the fact that he's gone. And, and it's that struggle of like, we feel comfortable talking about our emotions, but it's just so hard to let that go, because that was our life for so long. And while we're in a lot of ways very grateful for that time, it still hurts. And we didn't have normalcy forever for that whole period of time. So I think it's like, I will say, like, at least in the 10 years that have gone by, like the communication, especially with my parents, I think has been very strong and gotten stronger. To the point that it's like, my mom's my best friend, so I can tell her anything. And she feels the same way with me too.
Mhm. So it sounds like, from the perspective of having a trauma, your system really found ways to navigate through that in the healthiest way they could, and we're mindful to be available to attend to you in that space so that you could stay as healthy as possible in that. And that's complicated grieving, when you have a diagnosis and then a space of navigating that diagnosis and a real change into how your everyday looks. And then another layer of loss due to death, so that's very complicated grieving that occurs.
There was also too, and I definitely know this was something my parents struggled with on top of it, was there's this guilt. It wasn't nobody's fault that this happened to my dad, but there was just this guilt that they had too of we should have given you, they feel like they should have done better. They could have given me, done more for me, all that stuff. I mean, they've still felt that way even very recently. So I think and that's something was something especially for me too, that's been a recent discovery in my grief process, was the guilt. I didn't realize guilt was a part of it. But it very much is, because it's I even feel that way too, looking back, it's I should I have come home from work a little earlier to have an extra 30 more minutes with my dad every day. I kind of feel guilty over stuff like that. So I think was at least referring to the whole grief cycle or what you feel when you grieve, the guilt was something I never experienced early onset with his cancer diagnosis, but now dealing with the first year of his passing, it's immense.
Yeah, that's and guilt is a tough one to sit with, because I'm hearing you say should, could, and that's really shame. Shame starts to creep in with guilt, and that's where we can really kind of get some dysregulation, is when we allow shame to take up too much residence in that process. But it's real, that is definitely part of the pain and grieving. There's the light of grieving and the shadow of grieving, and you can shift on those different emotions and dwell there for a little bit.
Well, and so many caregivers, people who, they're not experiencing, your dad was the one who had the illness, but everyone's affected by it. And, like you said, 10 years is a long time to be a caretaker, especially at those pivotal years for you of development. And then I'm sure that, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some, not relief that he's gone, of course, please, I would never say that, but relief of the not knowing, the constant feeling of what's next, and because that's heavy and that's hard and it causes so much anxiety. So I understand that. I've been a caretaker as well, and it's then you feel guilty, because then you're well, I shouldn't feel it. Well, of course, you should feel whatever you're feeling. And I think we get into trouble when we try to push it and we start labeling what we're feeling as good or bad. In the grief process, I do not believe there are good or bad emotions. It's about letting them, feeling them, and moving through them. And like you said, seeing the lessons in them.
Yeah. And I will admit too, I think a huge relief too. And I think this is something, again, you don't really realize this until you actually experience this and see it for yourself. But although there was, 10 years, there was definitely high moments, low moments. And obviously he got rid of the cancer for most part, but he still was struggling, there was still just this uneasiness, because there was they didn't know what the short term or long term was going to be for this, diagnosis. So you're right, dealing with the what ifs, that is a relief, but also too, especially towards the end, because my dad's passing was very sudden and unexpected, and it was kind of an indirect correlation to a long-term consequence of this cancer. And to be honest, like, especially like for those 10 years, like just to see my dad in so much pain, like was hard enough. And he wasn't like that constantly, but still like it just was always a burden he carried. So to finally know that like he was getting like peace finally, I think that was like, that's a hard thing to accept, because, but at the same, just to give somebody like eternal peace, but at the same time though, that was like, it's a relief though, that like is kind of like my strength for every day, if that makes sense. Like it gives me like hope and kind of like sympathy a little bit, that, and kind of like calmness, that like, yeah, like, I mean, my dad's an internal peace, he's okay. Like, so I think like that's another big relief aspect to that. Like you don't really realize that that's something until they actually pass. But because you wouldn't want somebody to be in pain, you don't want anyone to feel pain their whole lives, let alone if you know someone that's like walking through life and, you know, they're on oxygen constantly, or, you know, they can't get up and walk. I mean, that it really does impact their truly maximum potential just to live fully, the way they should be. So
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And you said it so beautifully, because I think, you know, grief is for the people that are left behind, right? The person
Yeah.
who's passed, you know, like you said, they're at peace and they're no longer feeling pain, mental or physical anguish that they were in. And so we now carry the grief, like Cristine said, because that's love there that we're still feeling, but can't give out, right? We're grieving that loss of that. And so you said that so beautifully. Thank you.
Of course.
Cristine, so when someone comes in and, you know, is ready for what is one of the first things that you start looking at with grief?
You know, one of the first things we do from a therapeutic perspective is really just, you know, hold space for them to have permission to feel and to speak and to just be witnessed in that moment. And, you know, a lot of times they'll start with like, I know I should be over this, or I know I should be through this. And they have their own judgments of self around their grieving process. So really just providing that permission to grieve in the way that they need to start.
And Nicole, so after, you know, compiling your book and writing it and getting it out there and sharing it with people, what is one piece of advice you would offer someone who is experiencing the grief process and loss process?
I would probably say, I mean, if I was to kind of summarize one big piece, it would be recognizing that, and we kind of touched on it earlier, you know, you mentioned about memory, like keeping the person alive, those little moments like still burning inside you. And I think that's so important. Like, and I'm going to talk specifically too about like actually grief specifically to losing a loved one, or like losing a part of your life, so to speak, in some capacity, is there's so much more. Like love still continues and grows and flourish. And just because someone's buried in the ground does not mean that stuff can't emerge beautifully and transcend beyond the grave. And that's something I've discovered recently, that, you know, I've still been able to find, even though it's still a struggle, I've still been able to find peace and comfort, resiliency, compassion, and love in every day, even despite dealing with grief. And I think, yeah, like it being able to, you know, if you are feeling grief, you know, that just shows you how much love is in you too. And that's something that you should be, you know, don't, you know, hate on yourself because of that. Love yourself because of that, because like it's a wonderful thing about you. And it's something that love is just going to be channeled into future things for you. So I would definitely kind of just say something like, just on the lines of, there's so much positivity that will emerge from this. And a true fact already is just your love for that time, for that person. It's just going to be stronger and channeled into something bigger.
I love that you said that. Let it be a reflection of your capacity to love, not necessarily of the loss. Because I do think some people who go through the grieving process, especially with death, Sometimes a parent who loses a child, or, they will cut off the ability to love because they're afraid of loss again. But to let this be your grieving is a reflection of your capacity is, I think, a beautiful way to reflect it to people or clients or, others, and let it be an acknowledgement of beauty within yourself and not of a reflection of what's externally missing. Yeah.
Well, and I also have to say, I think what you've done by creating this book is you've honored your grief and loss process, and you've honored your dad, you've honored your family, and you've honored yourself through this. And I think that is so beautiful. So often we have experiences that are labeled bad and we want to just, burn past them, right? We just want to leave them in the rear view mirror, but we can't. They are part of our tapestry of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to integrate them and include them so that we could see the whole tapestry. And I think that's lovely. And I cannot wait to see more of the work that you create in the world and the more people that you touch, Nicole, because I mean, you are definitely made to be a writer and a storyteller and a creative and a thought leader. I really believe so. I think that you're leading the charge on this, especially for young people. So thank you.
No, thank you so much for your kind words. And yeah, I think I laugh at it sometimes, but yeah, whenever, I do talks or I speak for, to libraries and stuff like that, that is, usually the first big thing that shocks people. They're like, how old are you? They're shocked that you wrote a memoir at such a young age. And it's like, and I think I'm kind of like, usually I'm like, well, thank you. But also at the same time, it's like, it just shows you this happens at any age, it can happen to anyone. Yeah. And it, to your point, you're right. It's, kind of now bringing this to a younger demographic a little bit, and the mental health stigma and everything like that, and being able to make our emotions transparent, our stories kind of more open to everyone. It's so important to start talking about this and offer more resources. And I do find, yes, I think my book, while it does talk about, my time in high school and early college, and focusing on that age, people have picked this up of all ages, so I think it's something that I'm honored to, that it has spanned generations in terms of how these lessons can impact you and help you navigate these challenging moments.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead, put all of Nicole's information in our description box, where you can find her books, you can find her website, and learn more about her journey, and check out the books. They're lovely. Thank you. And do you have any events coming up?
Nothing super, at least kind of on a larger platform, but I do have a lot of local events in Pittsburgh happening. So if you are in the Pittsburgh, or Ohio kind of area, West Virginia, definitely check out some of my events locally. I'll have a couple of those coming up here through the summer, which is very exciting. But other than that, I usually do Instagram lives monthly with another one of my author friends. So usually the first week of the month I do those. So if you want to learn anything and everything about book writing and creatively trying to express yourself through that, feel free to check out my Instagram for that.
Wonderful. We'll include that link as well in our description box. All right, Cristine, do you have anything else to offer?
Just, thank you so much, Nicole, for, sharing your insight and being vulnerable enough to bring your journey into that share space as well. It really, touched me in a space too. So I appreciate that.
Well, thank you guys so much for having me on your show, and all your listeners too. I really appreciate this. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Oh, thank you. It was very powerful. Something that most people don't talk about, right? So that's what I loved about it. It's yeah, this is part of life, right? Let's have that conversation. All right, everyone. We will see you next time. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.